Greetings, Exiles. GZ here. GGG is listening to us, but not in a bad way. They've heard our complaints regarding a lot of the pain points that have been popping up over the Path of Exile through early access and are addressing a lot of them in this patch. So without further ado, let's go over some of the most important things. Starting off, I believe the most important thing is that respec costs are now cheaper, resulting in roughly a 50% cheaper respec cost at the start of Endgame. For example, pre-patch my Titan at level 70 had a respec cost of 4,042 per normal passive point. My post-patch Pathfinder at level 71 has a cost of 2213. It's still quite expensive to respec Ascendancy nodes with a cost of around 11,000 at that same level, but it's much more affordable with half the cost at the beginning of Endgame, which is where you might start to notice that you need to use some of those respecs as you've just come off of the campaign and are now in much more difficult content. And speaking of difficulty in the Endgame, they've been adjusting that too. Previously at tier 6 and tier 11 maps, you would be imposed another -10 res penalty for your fire, cold, and lightning. That's no longer the case. They have removed that, so you're dealing at Endgame with -60 now, which is much better than before. Everybody basically just got +20 all elemental resistances. That's awesome. Monsters are also less dangerous overall, dealing 40% less bonus damage from crits, chaos damage now scaling less aggressively over time, a bunch of minor tuning to specific things. Monster modifiers like the volatile crystals modifier has been completely removed pending telegraphing improvements, so it's clear that it's going to come back, but that they agreed that it was too difficult to see. Flask charges siphoned was apparently draining at 10 times the flask charges that it was supposed to, unintentionally, so that has been fixed. Purple explosives from the volatile plants now deal significantly less damage. Elite monsters were appearing with too high of a density in Breach, meaning that as soon as you open a Breach, you would get way overwhelmed, which I definitely noticed the first time that I opened my first Breach. Now let's get into the improvement for the Trial of Ascendancy options. First off, there's one change which I think is actually probably easy to overlook for Trial of Chaos, which is that the Stormcaller runes, you give more time to escape once triggered, is important, especially if they are actually now completely dodgeable, as those runes really would just fill up the entire arena and basically you couldn't avoid them. Most of the changes, however, for the Ascendancy trials are for the Trial of the Sekimas. Now, honor damage scales down based on distance to enemies. You're now taking 35% less damage at point blank, tapering away as you're further from monsters, creating a bit of an interesting choice. If you are a ranged character and you're more likely to have less honor, do you want to risk being closer to a monster and potentially getting hit, but you have that benefit of less honor damage taken? Or do you want to be further away off-screening them, but maybe you get hit by a stray projectile and it does full damage to you? This is obviously a pure buff for melee characters who want to be in that close range anyway. They also fixed a bug where damage over time was dealing 3 times as much damage to honor as intended. Getting hit by one of those little flamethrowers and being ignited would basically kill you outright in 100% of scenarios. Also, apparently honor resistance was only applying to 2/3 of the damage taken over time. I guess that one was confusing for Geekigi as well. Most importantly on this entire list, however, aside from the distance scaling on honor damage, I think is the volcanoes created by Rattlecage's Fissure Slam now lasts half the duration. This is the first boss that you will fight in the Trial of the Sekimas, the one that creates those little cremation volcanoes around. After a certain amount of time, the entire arena was effectively just Volcano City, and there was nothing that you could do to avoid them. You just kind of had to bait the attack into a corner, hope that he didn't decide he wanted to do it while he was facing the center of the room. Now, they last half the duration, which means that the arena will naturally clean itself up over time. Probably still want to be cautious about where you're placing those things, but it's not such a big deal if you misplace one. Now, the skill balance section is a little bit thick, and I'm not going to go over the whole thing. I will be linking the patch notes down in the description if you just wanted to Control F your favorite skill to see if anything was changed. But as far as notable changes go, we're going to go down the list of those. Vine Arrow and Tornado Shot's damage over time has been adjusted. It's now slightly higher at lower levels and substantially lower at higher levels. Apparently these skills were doing much higher base damage than intended. They were always meant to propagate either poison or projectiles respectively, and were doing much more than that, with Vine Arrow one-shotting pinnacle bosses at too high of a level. So those have been substantially nerfed. If you're using them for their intended purpose, however, of propagating poisons and projectiles, then you don't have anything to worry about. Physical and chaos damage over time skills have been buffed pretty substantially. Damage on Unearth, Bone Storm, Bone Cage, Bone Blast, and Power Siphon results in approximately 50% more damage at gem level 25 for all of those skills. Damage on Essence Drain, Contagion, Profane Ritual, and Chaos Bolt results in approximately 33% more damage at gem level 25. It's great to hear because Essence Drain has historically not had a great track record for single target damage, with all of the limits on support gems making it much more difficult to have multiple chaos damage over time skills. That damage buff is much warranted. If you're a minion enjoyer, you may notice that Skeletal Arsonist spirit costs now match Frost and Ice mages from level 5 onwards, keeping them the same at early game, but more expensive later on, as they were too cheap for what they provided. And finally, the concoction skills from the Pathfinder Ascendancy now consume fewer charges and deal much more damage. 66% more damage when the skill is level 20, in addition to added base damage, favoring Poison and Bleeding Concoction with greater damage buffs on those guys. A couple of them have an additional base crit chance, with the others that didn't get that treatment now having a little bit more specialization within their niche, either afflicting enemies with ailments more readily or having a higher magnitude of the ailments that they do inflict. Next up, we come to support balance. There are actually 2 new support gems coming to the game. First, the Tremors support, which is Aftershock focused. It provides a +% chance to trigger either 1, 2, or 3 additional Aftershocks, decreasing as you go up in number. So it's a 10% chance to trigger 3 Aftershocks with a pretty sizable chance to only trigger 1. But you do impose a 35% less damage penalty, so you really just have to kind of math that out and figure out if it's right for your build. The next one is the Bidding support, which gives more damage to the command skills of supported minions. This is things like Gas Arrow for the Skeletal Archers or the Detonate Minion on command for the Skeletal Arsonists. The last thing that I think is worth mentioning is in the item balance section, which is that the charm modifiers on belts have been made substantially more common and now appear at much lower levels. You might have noticed that you made it to endgame without ever finding a belt with more than 1 charm slot. Now the +1 charm of Symbolism modifier appears at level 23, and the +2 modifier of Inscription now appears from level 64 onwards. These are suffixes and not implicit, so you will need to sacrifice some resistance or some attributes. And then a myriad of bug fixes, 12 client crashes, and 3 instance crashes. I feel like these changes are fantastic, and I'm so excited to see this game progress. It was getting a little bit dicey there for a while with silence from Gigigi, especially as they were, very kind of heavy-handedly telling us about all of the nerfs, but to see some of the underutilized skills getting buffed, respec costs going down, endgame difficulty being adjusted, it truly gives me hope. If you liked the video and you enjoyed the highlights, please leave a like and subscribe. Follow me over on Twitch if you'd like to hang out in the stream. And as always, I'm Jeezy, and I'll see you in the next one.